I was seconds away from selling my father's legacy to the man who killed him, until a mysterious stranger revealed the terrifying truth hidden inside my silver pen. Now, I'm the most hunted man in the city, discovering that I wasn't just born to inherit an empire, I was built to be its ultimate weapon. The rain wasn't just falling, it was punishing the pavement, a rhythmic, violent drumming that matched the frantic beating of my heart. I sat in the far corner booth of the Rusty Spoon, a diner that had seen better decades, clutching a thick manila envelope so tightly my knuckles were turning a ghostly, bloodless white. Inside those pages was my salvation, or my damnation. At that moment, I honestly didn't care which. My name is Elias Thorne. 6 months ago, I was the golden boy of Thorne Logistics, a multi-million-dollar shipping empire. Today, I was a man with a negative bank balance, a pending eviction notice, and a reputation that had been dragged through the mud by people I once called brothers. I had been set up, stripped of my inheritance, and left with nothing but a burning, toxic desire to claw my way back up, no matter who I had to step on. The deal I was about to strike was simple, yet lethal. I had access to the master encryption codes of the Thorne server, codes my father had entrusted to me on his deathbed. If I handed them over to Marcus Vane, the very man who had orchestrated the hostile takeover that ruined me, he would pay me $10 million. It was blood money. It would give Vane total control, allowing him to dismantle the company and fire thousands of employees, many of whom had worked for my father for 30 years and looked at him like a god. It was a betrayal of everything my family stood for. But as I looked at the coffee stains on my threadbare sleeve and felt the hollow ache of hunger in my stomach, the legacy felt like a heavy anchor dragging me into the dark depths of the ocean. 10 million, I whispered to the empty booth, the words tasting like ash. 10 million, and I can start over, somewhere warm, somewhere where nobody knows the name Thorne, somewhere I don't have to be a failure. I checked my watch. 11:45 p.m. Vane's courier was supposed to be here at midnight. I pulled a pen from my inner pocket, a heavy silver fountain pen my father had given me on the day I graduated from business school. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was going to use his final gift to sign away his life's work. My hand trembled as I laid the pen on the table. The bell above the door chimed, cutting through the low hum of the refrigerator. I stiffened, sliding the envelope under the table, my heart leaping into my throat. But it wasn't the slick, suit-wearing courier I expected. It was an old man drenched to the bone, wearing a trench coat that looked like it had survived a war. He didn't head for the counter to order. He walked straight toward my booth with a strange, deliberate gait and sat down across from me without asking for permission. "Rough night for a stroll," the man said. His voice was like grinding stones, deep and weary, yet possessed an odd authority. "I'm waiting for someone," I said, my voice sharper and more defensive than I intended. "This table is taken. There are plenty of empty booths, pal." The man didn't move. He didn't even look at the menu. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, hand-carved wooden chess piece, a white knight, and placed it on the Formica tabletop between us. He looked at it for a long moment, then looked at me with eyes that seemed to see right through the layers of my desperation and my expensive yet fraying lies. "The night is a tricky piece, Elias," he said. My heart skipped a beat. A cold sweat broke out across my neck. "How do you know my name?" The old man ignored the question, his gaze fixed on the wooden carving. "The night is the only one that can jump over others. It can escape a trap that seems airtight. It feels powerful because it doesn't follow the rules of the grid, but if it jumps into the wrong square, it's cornered. And once a knight is cornered, the game is usually over in 3 moves. You're about to make your move, Elias. Are you sure you've looked at the square where you're landing?" I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Who are you? Did Vane send you to test me? Tell him I have the codes. I'm ready to sign. Just give me the money and let's get this over with." The old man chuckled, a dry, hollow sound that lacked any mirth. Vane? No. Marcus Vane doesn't play chess. He plays wrecking ball. He doesn't care about the board. He just wants to see the pieces break so he can sell the scrap metal. He leaned forward, the smell of ozone and old parchment clinging to him like a shroud. I'm here because you're about to make a choice. A choice you think is about survival, but is actually about erasure. You sign that paper, and the man your father loved ceases to exist. Only a ghost remains, haunted by the echoes of the lives he ruined for a few stacks of paper. I gripped the edge of the table, my anger finally bubbling over. You don't know my situation. I have nothing. This legacy people talk about, it's a myth. It's a cage. I've been living in my car for 3 weeks. I'm just taking what's mine so I can live again. What would you know about it? Is that what you told yourself when you walked in here? The stranger asked softly. He tapped the white knight. You think you're jumping over the obstacle, but you aren't seeing the whole board. You're so focused on the exit that you haven't realized the door is rigged with explosives. Just then, the diner door swung open again. This time, it was him. A man in a tailored charcoal suit, holding a high-end leather briefcase. He scanned the room, his eyes locking onto mine with the predatory gleam of a shark that had finally caught the scent of blood in the water. He started walking toward us, his polished shoes clicking sharply on the linoleum, a sound that felt like nails being driven into a coffin. The old man didn't turn around. He stayed focused on me, his expression turning intensely grave. The courier is here. The pen is in your hand. But before you touch that paper, I want you to look at the fountain pen your father gave you. Really look at it, Elias. Don't look at the silver. Look at the weight. I looked down at the silver pen. In the flickering yellow light of the diner, I noticed something for the first time. The pen felt unbalanced, slightly heavier toward the cap than it should have been. The courier reached the table, hovering over us like a dark cloud. Elias, you have the codes? He glanced at the old man with a look of pure disdain. Who is this? Your lawyer? I didn't answer him. I was staring at the pen. The stranger leaned in one last time, his voice a mere shadow of a whisper that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. He didn't just give you a pen, Elias. He gave you the map. And if you sign that contract right now, you'll be burning the only map that leads to the truth about how he really died. You think it was a heart attack? Ask yourself why Vane was the first person at the hospital. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. My father's death had been sudden, yes, but the doctors were certain. Yet the stranger's words hit me like a physical blow. I looked from the pen to the stranger, then to the courier, who was impatiently reaching for the manila envelope I had tucked under my thigh. What did you just say? I gasped, my voice trembling. The stranger stood up, his form almost blurring into the shadows of the diner. The choice is yours, Elias. Wealth and silence, or the truth and a war you aren't prepared for. But remember, once you sign, the knight is taken off the board. The courier slammed his briefcase onto the table. His patience evaporated. Ignore the old crazy man, Elias. He's probably a vagrant looking for a handout. Sign the papers. $10 million is waiting for you in an offshore account. The transfer is ready. Do it now or the offer dies tonight, and I ensure you never work in this industry again. I looked at the signature line on the contract Vane had prepared. My hand was shaking so hard the silver pen rattled against the table. I looked back at the stranger, but he was already halfway to the door. Just as he reached the exit, he turned his head slightly, his eyes flashing with an unearthly light. "Check the ink reservoir, Elias," he said. "The real treasure was never the company." The door swung shut behind him. The courier shoved a gold ballpoint pen toward me, his face contorting into a mask of redirected rage. "Forget the fountain pen. Use this. Sign. Now." Driven by a sudden frantic impulse, I ignored the courier. I grabbed my father's silver pen and began to unscrew the barrel, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't look at the contract, I looked at the internal mechanism, and as I pulled the ink reservoir apart, a small metallic object fell out. Not a part of the pen, but a tiny high-density microchip wrapped in a sliver of paper with a handwritten note in my father's cramped, unmistakable script. The courier's eyes widened to the size of saucers. His face went from pale to a sickly, mottled gray. He recognized the chip instantly. His hand shot out like a snake to grab it, but I was faster, pulling it back against my chest. "That's not part of the deal," I snapped, my voice finally finding its strength. "Everything is part of the deal," the courier hissed, his professional veneer cracking to reveal something far more dangerous. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket, and I saw the unmistakable cold glint of a handgun equipped with a silencer. "Give it to me, Elias," he growled, his voice dropping to a murderous whisper. "Give it to me right now, or you won't live long enough to see the sun rise, let alone spend a single cent of Vane's money." The barrel of the suppressor was a black, hollow eye staring directly at my chest. In that moment, the air in the diner seemed to thicken, turning into something heavy and suffocating. The hum of the refrigerator, the rain against the glass, the distant sound of a siren, it all faded into a dull roar in my ears. The courier, a man whose name I didn't even know, had shed his corporate mask. He wasn't a businessman, he was a shark, and I was bleeding in the water. "The money was a lie, wasn't it?" I asked, my voice a jagged edge of its former self. My fingers were curled tightly around the microchip, the cold metal biting into my palm. The courier's lips curled into a mirthless smile. "Marcus Vane doesn't like loose ends, Elias. And he certainly doesn't pay $10 million for things he can simply take from a desperate man's corpse. You were never leaving this diner with anything but a bullet. Now, put the chip on the table and slide it over. Maybe I'll make it quick." My mind raced, jumping through the squares the old man had mentioned. I was a knight, cornered. If I stayed, I was dead. If I ran, I was a target. I looked down at the contract, the paper I was supposed to sign. It was thick, high-quality bond paper. Next to it sat the pot of lukewarm, oily coffee the waitress had left 10 minutes ago. The old man was right, I whispered, more to myself than to him. I wasn't seeing the whole board. "Last warning, Elias," the courier growled, his finger tightening on the trigger. I didn't think. I acted. In one fluid motion, I grabbed the handle of the coffee pot and swung it with every ounce of desperate strength I had left. The glass shattered against the side of the courier's head, spraying hot liquid and shards of glass everywhere. He let out a choked cry of rage and pain, his shot going wide. The silenced thwip of the gun was almost lost in the crash of the pot, but I saw the spark of the bullet hitting the vinyl of the booth, right where my heart had been a second before. I didn't wait for a second shot. I scrambled over the table, my boots sliding on the wet linoleum. I didn't head for the front door. That was too exposed. I bolted toward the swinging doors of the kitchen. "You're dead, Thorne!" the courier screamed, the sound of his chair scraping violently against the floor, echoing behind me. I burst into the kitchen. It was empty, the late-night cook probably out back for a smoke. The smell of old grease and floor cleaner was overwhelming. I didn't stop to look around. I headed straight for the heavy steel delivery door at the back. I threw the deadbolt and shouldered the door open, stumbling out into the alleyway. The rain hit me like a wall of ice. It was a torrential downpour now, the sky a bruised purple, the city lights reflecting off the oily puddles in the cracked pavement. I ran. I didn't have a car. I'd sold mine months ago to pay off a debt. I was on foot, in a suit that was now soaked and heavy, carrying a secret that had likely cost my father his life. I ducked behind a row of overflowing dumpsters just as the back door of the diner flew open. The courier stepped out, his face a mask of blood and coffee, the gun raised. He scanned the alley, his eyes darting back and forth. He was professional. He didn't run out blindly. He moved with a calculated, lethal grace. I held my breath, pressing my back against the cold, wet brick of the building. My heart was a drum in my ears, so loud I was sure he could hear it. I looked down at my hand. I still had the microchip, and I still had the sliver of paper that had been wrapped around it inside the pen. With trembling fingers, I unfolded the damp paper. The ink had blurred slightly from the rain, but the message was still legible. It wasn't a coordinate or a bank account number. It was a single sentence, written in my father's frantic hand. "The ghost is in the hull of the Cordelia. Don't trust the lighthouse." The Cordelia. That was the name of the flagship vessel of Thorn Logistics. It had been decommissioned and sold for scrap 3 months ago, sold to one of Marcus Vane's shell companies. My father had always called that ship his lucky lady. He'd spent more time on her than in our own home. A shadow fell across the brick wall opposite me. The courier was moving closer. I could hear his footsteps, slow, rhythmic, the sound of a predator closing in on a cornered animal. "I know you're here, Elias," he called out, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. "You're a Thorn. You were raised in boardrooms and penthouses. You don't know how to survive in the dirt. Give me the chip, and I'll tell Vane you put up a fight. I'll make it a clean shot." I looked around the alley. It was a dead end to my left, and the courier was blocking the exit to my right. I was trapped. Then I saw it. A rusted fire escape ladder dangling just a few feet above a stack of wooden pallets. It was a gamble. If I moved, he'd see me. If I stayed, he'd find me. I remembered the old man's words. The night is the only one that can jump over others. I grabbed a loose brick from the ground and hurled it toward the far end of the alley near the street. It smashed against a metal trash can with a loud clang. The courier spun toward the sound, his gun following his gaze. In that split second, I lunged for the pallets. I scrambled up, my fingers catching the bottom rung of the ladder. The metal was slick and freezing, and for a terrifying heartbeat, I thought I would slip. "There!" the courier hissed. He fired. The bullet whizzed past my ear, striking the brickwork with a puff of dust. I pulled myself up, my muscles screaming, and began to climb the shaking metal stairs as fast as I could. Another shot rang out, hitting the ladder below my feet, sending a vibration through my entire body. I reached the first-floor landing and didn't stop. I climbed higher and higher, the wind whipping my hair across my face, until I reached the roof of the 3-story building. I collapsed onto the gravel-covered surface, gasping for air, the rain soaking through to my bones. I crawled to the edge and looked down. The courier was standing in the middle of the alley looking up, his face contorted in a snarl. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone. He wasn't going to follow me up. He was calling for backup. He was going to surround the block. I rolled onto my back, staring up at the dark, weeping sky. I was alone, hunted, and possessed a piece of technology that could either bring down an empire or get me buried in a nameless grave. I sat up and looked at the microchip again. Then I looked at the note. "Don't trust the lighthouse." My father's lighthouse wasn't a building. It was the name of his head of security, a man named Arthur Vance, who had been like an uncle to me. He was the one who had told me my father died of a heart attack. He was the one who had encouraged me to take Vane's deal. The betrayal felt like a fresh wound. Everyone I had ever trusted was on the other side. I looked across the rooftops. About 2 blocks away, I saw the familiar neon sign of a 24-hour internet cafe. If I could get there, if I could see what was on this chip. I stood up, but as I turned to find a way down the other side of the building, a figure stepped out from behind a massive HVAC unit. It was the old man from the diner. He was bone dry. Despite the torrential downpour that had turned me into a drowned rat, not a single drop of water seemed to have touched his trench coat. He stood there, the wooden knight in his hand, watching me with those piercing, ancient eyes. "You made the jump," he said, his voice cutting through the wind. "But you're still on the board, Elias, and the Queen has just moved into position." Before I could ask him what he meant or how he'd gotten onto the roof, the sound of a heavy engine roared from the street below. A black SUV with tinted windows screeched to a halt in front of the building. Then another, and another. The old man pointed toward the opposite edge of the roof. "Run, Elias. The truth is heavier than you think. If you want to live to see the Cordelia, you need to lose the one thing you're still holding on to." "What?" I shouted over the wind. "The chip? The pen?" "No," the old man said, his image beginning to flicker like a dying light bulb. "Your name." Suddenly, the roof door burst open. It wasn't the courier. It was a team of men in tactical gear, their red laser sights dancing across the gravel, searching for a target. They didn't shout for me to put my hands up. They opened fire immediately. I dove toward the edge of the roof, my heart in my throat, and jumped toward the neighboring building. As I soared through the air, time seemed to slow down. I looked back, and the old man was gone. There was only the empty roof and the flashes of gunfire. I hit the other roof hard, rolling and skidding across the wet surface. I scrambled to my feet and kept running, ducking behind chimneys and vents. I found a maintenance hatch and wrenched it open, dropping into the dark interior of an apartment complex. I didn't stop until I reached the basement. I found a small, cramped boiler room and huddled in the corner, shaking with cold and adrenaline. I needed to see what was on the chip. I needed a computer. I reached into my pocket to make sure the chip was still there, but my hand brushed against something else, something that shouldn't have been there. I pulled it out. It was a small silver key with a tag attached to it. On the tag, in the same mysterious handwriting as the note, was an address for a storage locker on the outskirts of the city. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. The key was covered in fresh, wet blood, and as I looked down at my own hands, I realized I wasn't bleeding. Then, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from an unknown number. I opened it, my breath hitching. It was a photo taken from a high angle, looking down at me in the boiler room, right at that very moment. The caption read, "The game isn't over until the king falls. Look behind you, Elias." I spun around so fast I nearly tripped over a rusted pipe. My eyes searched the shadows of the boiler room, the steam-filled corners, the dark recesses behind the humming machinery. There was no one. The room was empty, save for the rhythmic thumping of the furnace and the hiss of escaping steam. But the photo on my phone didn't lie. It was taken from the ventilation duct near the ceiling, a high, slanted angle that captured the top of my head and the bloody key in my hand. I didn't wait to see if the photographer was still in the duct. I scrambled out of the boiler room, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I couldn't go back up into the apartment complex. They'd be waiting at every exit. I found a small street-level window used for coal deliveries decades ago. I kicked it open, the glass shattering with a sound that felt like a gunshot in the quiet basement, and squeezed through, tumbling onto the wet sidewalk of a side street. The city was a blur of neon and rain. I kept my head down, hunched in my soaked shirt, my expensive suit jacket left behind in the boiler room. I needed to disappear. "Lose your name," the old man had said. I walked for miles, sticking to the shadows, zigzagging through alleys and avoiding the main thoroughfares where the black SUVs would be patrolling. My mind was a whirlwind of questions. Who was the old man? How did he know about the ship? And why was the key covered in blood? By 3 a.m., I reached the outskirts of the industrial district. Midnight Storage was a sprawling, desolate facility surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence. The air here smelled of salt and rotting timber. The docks were only a few blocks away. I found locker 412 in the furthest corner of the lot. The silver key slid into the lock with a sickeningly smooth click. I pulled the corrugated metal door up, the screeching sound echoing through the empty facility. Inside, there was no treasure, no stacks of cash, just a single military-grade laptop on a folding card table and a cardboard box. I stepped inside and pulled the door shut, plunging myself into darkness before clicking on a small desk lamp. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely open the laptop. I plugged the microchip into the side port and waited. The screen flickered to life, but it didn't ask for a password. Instead, a video file began to play automatically. It was my father. He looked 20 years older than the last time I'd seen him, his face gaunt, his eyes rimmed with shadows. He was sitting in what looked like the captain's quarters of a ship, the Cordelia. "Elias," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "If you're seeing this, it means I'm already gone, and Arthur Vance has finally shown his true colors. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you the truth. Thorn Logistics was never just a shipping company. We were a shield. For 30 years, we've been the only thing stopping Marcus Vane from using our routes to move something that would change the face of this country in the worst possible way." He coughed, a wet, hacking sound that made my stomach churn. "The heart attack. It won't be an accident. They've been putting digitalis in my tea for weeks. Arthur knows. He's the one serving it. The microchip you're holding contains the manifest of the ghost cargo, currently sitting in the hull of the Cordelia. Vane thinks he bought the ship for scrap, but he's really using it as a floating fortress. You have to get to the ship, Elias. You have to trigger the scuttle sequence. If that cargo reaches the harbor, thousands will die." The video cut to black. I sat there in the silence of the storage locker, the weight of the revelation pressing down on me. My father hadn't just died. He'd been murdered by his best friend. And my inheritance wasn't a fortune. It was a suicide mission. I opened the cardboard box. Inside was a heavy black tactical vest, a map of the city's underground drainage system, and a burner phone. The phone suddenly chimed, a text message from the same unknown number. "The lighthouse is moving. He's at your mother's house. He knows you have the key." My blood turned to ice. My mother lived in a small cottage upstate, a place she'd retreated to after the funeral. She was fragile, completely unaware of the viper's nest my father had been living in. I grabbed the burner phone and dialed the only number I knew by heart. It rang once, twice, 3 times. "Hello?" My mother's voice was soft, sleepy. "Mom, it's Elias. You need to get out of the house. Right now. Don't ask questions. Just grab your coat and—" "Elias, is that you, dear?" "Mom, listen to me. Is Arthur there? Is anyone else in the house?" There was a long pause. I could hear the sound of a floorboard creaking on her end of the line. "Arthur is here, Elias," she said, her voice sounding strange, tight and controlled. "He said you might call. He said you were confused, that you'd stolen something important from Mr. Vane. Mom, Arthur is dangerous. He killed Dad. You have to run." "I'm afraid she can't do that, Elias." The voice on the other end wasn't my mother's anymore. It was Arthur Vance, cold, professional, and utterly devoid of the warmth I had known my entire life. "You were always the smart one, Elias. Too smart for your own good. Your father wanted to play hero, and look where it got him. Now you have a choice. You bring that microchip to the Cordelia by dawn, or I'll show your mother exactly how we handled your father's heart condition. Do you understand? If you touch her, Arthur, I swear to God, 5 o'clock, Elias. The docks. Pier 9. Don't be late. And don't bring the old man. We know about him. He's a ghost from a past you don't understand." The line went dead. I slammed my fist against the card table, a primal scream of rage ripping from my throat. I was being played. Every move I made was being anticipated. I looked at the laptop screen. The manifest was still there, a list of chemical precursors and biological components that made my skin crawl. I had 2 hours. I strapped on the tactical vest, stuffed the laptop into a waterproof bag, and looked at the map of the drainage system. It led directly from the industrial district to the underside of Pier 9. It was a labyrinth of filth and darkness, but it was the only way to move without being seen by Vane's drones. I stepped out of the storage locker, locking it behind me. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle. As I turned toward the fence, a pair of headlights cut through the gloom. A black SUV was idling at the gate. I didn't run. I couldn't. I was tired of running. I walked toward the vehicle, my hand hovering near the burner phone. The window rolled down. It wasn't the courier. It wasn't Arthur Vance. It was a woman I hadn't seen in 5 years. Sarah, my father's former assistant. The woman I had loved and then pushed away when the company started to crumble. She looked terrified, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Get in," she hissed. "They're coming, Elias. Not just Vane's men, the cleaners." "Sarah, what are you doing here? How did you find me?" "The old man," she said, her voice trembling. "He told me where you'd be. He said the night was about to be sacrificed to save the queen. Elias, your mother isn't at the cottage. Arthur was lying to you." "What? I just heard her voice." "That was a voice synthesizer, Elias. They've had her in a secure facility for 3 days. Arthur lures you to the ship to kill you and take the chip. If you go to Pier 9, you're walking into a slaughterhouse." I stood frozen in the rain. Who was I supposed to trust? The woman who had disappeared when I lost everything, or the voice of the man who had raised me? Suddenly, a red laser dot appeared on Sarah's forehead. "Sarah, get down!" I screamed, lunging for the car door. A muffled crack echoed through the lot. The windshield shattered in a spiderweb of glass. Sarah gasped, her head snapping back as a bloom of crimson erupted against the leather seat. I dove for the pavement as a second shot punched into the door panel. I scrambled behind the SUV, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked through the shattered window at Sarah. Her eyes were wide, staring at nothing, a perfect hole right between her brows. I looked back toward the storage units. Standing on top of locker 412 was a figure in a dark coat, holding a long-range rifle. The silhouette was unmistakable. It was the old man. He lowered the rifle, his face illuminated by a flash of lightning. He wasn't looking at me with pity or wisdom anymore. He was smiling, a terrifying, jagged grin that chilled me to my core. "The night is off the board," he shouted over the thunder. "Welcome to the endgame, Elias." He raised the rifle again, but not at me. He pointed it at the massive fuel tank sitting at the entrance of the storage facility. "Wait!" I yelled, but it was too late. He pulled the trigger. The world turned into a screaming wall of orange and white. The explosion of the fuel tank was so violent that the shock wave physically lifted me off the ground, throwing me backward like a rag doll. I hit the gravel hard, the air driven from my lungs in a single agonizing burst. For a few seconds, there was no sound, only a high-pitched, ringing vacuum that seemed to vibrate inside my skull. I rolled onto my side, gasping, my vision swimming with dark spots. The storage facility was a nightmare of twisted metal and roiling black smoke. The SUV Sarah had been driving was a blackened skeleton, the heat from the nearby inferno melting the tires into stinking puddles of rubber. Sarah. I looked toward the shattered windshield, but the flames were too high. She was gone. The only person who had tried to help me was Ash because of the old man. I looked up at the roof of locker 412. The old man was gone. He had vanished into the smoke as if he had never been there at all. "Why?" I wheezed, the word lost in the roar of the fire. Sirens began to wail in the distance. Real ones this time, not the phantom sounds of my paranoia. I couldn't stay here. I grabbed the waterproof bag containing the laptop and the microchip, my movements sluggish and clumsy. My ribs felt like they had been kicked in by a horse, and my left arm was slick with blood from a piece of flying debris. I stumbled toward the back of the lot, toward the drainage grate marked on the map. I wrenched the iron cover up with a primal grunt of effort and dropped into the darkness just as the first police cruisers roared into the facility. The sewers were a different kind of hell. The air was thick with the stench of stagnant water and industrial runoff. I waded through knee-deep sludge, my flashlight beam cutting a weak path through the gloom. I kept the map open in one hand, the paper damp and trembling. I had to get to the Cordelia. As I walked, I pulled out the burner phone. There was a new message. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the sender. "Sarah, I'm sorry, Elias. I had to make it look real. If they think I'm dead, they stop looking for the leak. Use the vents in Sector 4. Don't go to the deck. The ghost isn't a cargo. It's a person. My brain stalled. Sarah was alive? Was the old man's shot a deliberate miss? Or was this another layer of the game? I looked at the blood on my hands. Sarah's blood. It had felt real. It had looked real. But in this world of shadows and mirrors, nothing was what it seemed. I reached a junction in the tunnels where the ceiling dropped low, the walls covered in a thick, pulsating layer of black mold. I sat on a narrow concrete ledge, my breath echoing in the pipe. I needed to see that manifest again. I pulled out the laptop and booted it up, the blue light of the screen casting ghostly shadows against the sewer walls. I bypassed the video file and dove into the raw data on the chip. My father had encrypted it with a cipher we used to play with when I was a child, the Thorn cipher. It took me 10 minutes of frantic typing to break the final seal. When the file finally opened, it wasn't a list of chemicals. It was a dossier. Subject, Project Eidolon. Status, Final Phase. Description, Digital Consciousness Transfer and Biometric Override. Underneath the text were medical diagrams of a human brain laced with neural filaments that looked like the micro-wiring of a computer. And then I saw the name of the subject. Subject 0, Arthur Vance. I felt a coldness settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the damp air. Arthur wasn't just a traitor. He was a vessel. My father hadn't been trying to stop a shipment. He had been trying to stop a transformation. Marcus Vane wasn't just building a company. He was building a way to live forever, using the Thorn shipping empire as a front to transport the experimental technology required to sustain the process. And the Cordelia was the laboratory. "He's not a person anymore," I whispered, the words echoing back at me from the dark. I checked the time, 4:15 a.m. I was running out of time. I shoved the laptop back into the bag and began to climb a rusted ladder that led toward the surface near Pier 9. My muscles screamed in protest, each movement a jagged spike of pain. I emerged into the salt-heavy air of the docks. The Cordelia loomed over the pier like a prehistoric beast, its massive hull covered in patches of rust and salt. It looked abandoned, but the hum of high-powered generators vibrated through the concrete under my feet. There were no guards on the perimeter. Vane was confident. Or he wanted me to enter. I found the ventilation duct Sarah had mentioned. It was a narrow, cramped passage that smelled of ozone and expensive air filtration. I crawled through it for what felt like miles, my knees scraping against the metal, until I reached a grate overlooking the main cargo hold. I looked down, and my breath caught. The hold had been gutted and replaced with a sterile, white-lit medical suite. Hundreds of computer servers hummed in racks along the walls, their blue LEDs blinking in a chaotic symphony. In the center of the room was a glass-walled chamber. Inside the chamber, strapped to a chair that looked like an electric throne, was my mother. She looked pale, her eyes closed, a series of thin, glowing wires attached to her temples. Standing over her was Arthur Vance. But he wasn't looking at her with malice. He was looking at her with a terrifying blank intensity. "The synchronization is at 80%. A voice boomed over the intercom. It was Marcus Vane. He was standing on a balcony overlooking the hold, his face twisted into a mask of triumph. "Once the transfer is complete, the Thorn legacy will finally be useful. A mind with all the codes, all the history, but with a loyalty that cannot be broken." "You can't do this, Marcus," Arthur said, but his voice was different. It was layered, as if two people were speaking at once. "The vessel is weak. She won't survive the integration." "Then we find another," Vane snapped. "But for now, she is the only one with the biometric resonance we need. Bring the boy. He's here. I can smell the desperation on him." I gripped the edge of the vent, my knuckles turning white. I had to move. I had to stop the sequence. I looked at the control panel near the chamber. If I could just get to the manual override. I kicked the grate open and dropped 20 feet onto a stack of shipping crates, rolling to the floor. I didn't wait for them to react. I bolted for the chamber, the microchip gripped in my hand like a dagger. "Elias!" My mother's voice cracked through the room. Her eyes flew open, but they weren't blue anymore. They were a glowing, synthetic violet. "Run! It's not a transfer, it's a trap!" Arthur Vance turned toward me, his movements blurred and inhumanly fast. He caught me by the throat before I could even raise my arm, his grip like a vice made of cold steel. He lifted me off the ground, my feet dangling in the air. "You're late, Elias," Arthur, or whatever was inside him, hissed. I struggled, kicking at his chest, but it was like hitting a stone wall. I looked up at the balcony at Marcus Vane, who was smiling down at me. "The chip, Elias," Vane said softly. "The one you're holding. It's not the manifest. It's the final key. The one your father hid inside his own son's DNA." I looked down at my hand. The microchip wasn't just a piece of plastic. It began to glow, the light sinking into my skin, my veins turning a luminous, terrifying silver. "What did you do to me?" I screamed, the pain starting to radiate from my hand up to my shoulder. "Your father didn't want to stop us," Vane laughed, the sound echoing through the hollow ship. "He wanted to perfect us, and you, Elias, you're the masterpiece." Suddenly, the ship's lights cut out. A deep, guttural moan of twisting metal filled the air as the Cordelia began to tilt violently to the port side. From the shadows at the edge of the hold, the old man stepped out. He was holding a remote detonator, his eyes fixed on me. "The night takes the queen," he whispered, his voice carrying clearly even through the chaos. "But the king must fall for the game to reset." He pressed the button. A series of explosions ripped through the hull of the ship, below the water line. The ocean began to pour in, a freezing torrent of black water that surged into the medical suite. Arthur lost his grip on me as the floor buckled. I fell into the rising water, the silver light in my veins pulsing in time with the sinking ship. I looked toward my mother, but the glass chamber was already being swallowed by the sea. As I struggled to the surface, I saw a figure swimming toward me through the wreckage. It was Sarah. She grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with terror. "Elias, look at your chest!" she screamed. I looked down through the murky water. Underneath my skin, a digital countdown had appeared, glowing a fierce, radioactive red. 0059, 0058, 0057. It's not a key, I realized, the horror finally breaking through the adrenaline. I'm the bomb. The countdown on my chest was a rhythmic, pulsing nightmare. 045, 044. The red light reflected off the churning black water that was quickly filling the hold of the Cordelia. "Elias, we have to go, now!" Sarah screamed, her voice barely audible over the groaning of the ship's dying metal and the roar of the ocean. She was treading water, her hand desperately reaching for my collar to pull me toward the jagged hole in the hull. But I couldn't move. The silver veins in my arm were vibrating, a high-pitched frequency that seemed to be communicating with the servers lining the walls. I wasn't just a bomb. I was a virus. My father hadn't turned me into a weapon of mass destruction. He had turned me into a biological kill switch. The Project Eidolon data, the digital ghosts of men like Vane and Arthur, was designed to be immortal. I was the only thing in the world that could delete them. "The servers," I gasped, pointing to the central column where the lights were flickering frantically. "If I leave, the data survives. Vane wins. He'll just start over in another facility with another victim." I looked at the glass chamber. My mother was slumped against the reinforced walls, the violet light in her eyes fading as the water began to seep into her enclosure. "The night protects the queen," a voice said. I looked up. The old man was standing on a catwalk that was almost entirely submerged. He wasn't dry anymore. The ocean had finally claimed him, his trench coat heavy and sodden. He looked tired, older than the stars themselves. He was about to make a grave mistake, the old man said, looking not at me but past me. He thought the game was about winning, but the game is about ensuring the board is clean for the next player. "Who are you?" I yelled, the water reaching my chin. The old man smiled, and for a second I saw a flash of my father's eyes in his weathered face. "I'm the advice you needed, Elias. Now make the move." 022. 021. I pushed Sarah away. "Get her out! Get my mother!" "Elias, no! Go!" I roared. I dove under the water. The world became a silent, weightless chaos of wires and debris. I kicked with everything I had, the silver light in my veins guiding me like a compass. I reached the central server column, the heart of the Cordelia. There was a circular port at the base, glowing with the same violet light I'd seen in my mother's eyes. I didn't need a key. I didn't need a code. I slammed my glowing hand into the port. The surge was agonizing. It felt like my very soul was being shredded and pulled through a needle's eye. Every memory, every thought, every fragment of who I was being scanned, translated, and weaponized. I saw the Project Eidolon files, thousands of digital consciousnesses, Marcus Vane's backup plans, Arthur Vance's corrupted memories. They screamed in my mind a digital chorus of the damned. Delete, I thought. Delete it all. 0005, 0004. The red light on my chest turned from a pulse to a solid, blinding glare. 0001. 0000. There was no explosion of fire. There was only a soundless, white ripple that expanded from my hand. It was an electromagnetic pulse of impossible proportions, fueled by the unique biometric signature of a thorn. It swept through the ship, through the servers, and out across the harbor. I felt the connection snap. The digital ghosts vanished, the red light on my chest extinguished. The weight of the ocean finally pressed down on me. The light faded. The cold took over. I felt myself sinking into the dark, a knight who had finally reached the end of his path. I woke up to the sound of seagulls and the rhythmic sloshing of water against wood. My eyes cracked open to a gray, overcast sky. My lungs burned with every breath, and my body felt like it had been put through a meat grinder, but I was alive. I was lying on the deck of a small, weathered fishing boat. "He's awake," a voice whispered. I turned my head. My mother was sitting next to me, her eyes back to their natural, warm brown. She looked exhausted, but she was holding my hand so tightly I thought she might never let go. Sarah was at the helm, her face smudged with soot and salt, but she gave me a small, tearful smile when she saw me looking. "Where are we?" I croaked. 5 miles out from the harbor, Sarah said. "The Cordelia is at the bottom of the trench. The police think everyone on board perished in a freak engine explosion. Marcus Vane, Arthur Vance, they're gone. Elias. And the servers. They didn't just crash, they were wiped. Every backup, every satellite link. You did it." I sat up slowly, wincing as my muscles protested. I looked down at my chest. The skin was scarred, a faint silvery pattern where the countdown had been, but the glow was gone. I was just Elias Thorne again. No inheritance, no company, no negative bank balance. I looked toward the back of the boat. Sitting on a crate of fishing nets was a single object, the wooden knight. I picked it up, the carved wood smooth against my palm. Underneath the base of the piece, there were 4 words carved in fresh, sharp letters. "The board is reset." I looked toward the horizon, where the first rays of a pale sun were breaking through the clouds. I thought about the man I had been in that diner, the man who was ready to sell his soul for $10 million. The stranger had been right. That would have been a grave mistake. It wouldn't have been a new life. It would have been a long, slow suicide. "What do we do now?" my mother asked softly. I looked at the silver fountain pen sitting in my pocket. I pulled it out and unscrewed the cap. It was still heavy, still unbalanced, but the microchip was gone. I realized then that the weight wasn't from the chip. I unscrewed the very bottom of the barrel, a secret compartment I had never noticed before. Inside was a rolled-up piece of high-grade vellum. It wasn't a map or a code. It was a deed. A deed to a small private island in the Pacific, purchased by my father 30 years ago under a name I hadn't recognized until now. Elias Knight. "We go home," I said, a sense of peace finally settling over me. The stranger was gone, but his advice remained. I had seen the whole board. I had made my move. And for the first time in my life, the future didn't look like a trap. It looked like an open sea. I threw the wooden knight into the water, watching it bob for a moment before the wake of the boat swallowed it up. The game was over. I had lost everything, but in the wreckage of the Thorn Empire, I had finally found the one thing money couldn't buy. I had found my destiny.